Son called it a gift. He handed me a folder stuffed with papers and said, "Dad, we found a way to protect your assets." Inside was a reverse mortgage application, already signed with my name, that would hand over 60% of my name's equity. When I refused to go along with it, his wife screamed that I was being selfish, and my son shoved me against the kitchen wall and told me to start packing. 2 hours later, a sheriff's deputy was standing in my living room. But that was only the beginning of what they were about to lose. The coffee that Tuesday morning tasted the way it always does in late November. A little bitter, a little necessary. I'd been up since 5:30, the way I always am since my wife Carolyn passed 4 years ago. Sleep doesn't come the same way it used to. You wake up and reach for someone who isn't there, and after a while you stop fighting it and just get up and make coffee. I was reading the Journal Sentinel at the kitchen table when I heard the front door. Not a knock, just the door opening the way family does when they've stopped asking permission. My son Garrett came in first, already talking before he'd cleared the entryway. Beside him was his wife Stacy. She was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression she uses when she's decided something is already settled. "Morning, Dad." Garrett poured himself a cup of coffee from my pot without asking. He'd been doing that for 3 years. "We've got something we want to go over with you." I folded the paper. "Didn't know you were coming." "It's good news." Stacy set the portfolio on my kitchen table and unzipped it carefully, the way a surgeon lays out instruments. "We've been working with a financial consultant about the house." The house. Carolyn and I bought it in 1987. 3 bedrooms, a corner lot in Wauwatosa, a maple tree in the backyard that turns the color of fire every October. I'd spent 32 years maintaining it, paid it off in 2011, and started waking up in it alone in 2020. Stacy pulled out a thick folder and set it on top of my newspaper. I looked at the cover sheet. The words "Home Equity Conversion Mortgage" were printed across the top in clean sans serif type. "A reverse mortgage," I said. "It's not what you think." Garrett sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. This was his persuasion posture. I recognized it from every time he'd needed money since he was 19. "It's a financial tool. You're sitting on $400,000 in equity, and you're not using any of it. Meanwhile, you're on a fixed income, and the property taxes went up again this year." I turned to the second page. There was a signature line near the bottom. My name was already typed beneath it. "When did you have this prepared?" "The consultant prepared it. That's his job." "That's not what I asked." Stacy smiled, the kind that doesn't move her eyes. "Garrett's been worried about you, Neal. We both have. You're 68 years old, living alone in a 4-bedroom house. The maintenance alone." "I manage the maintenance fine." "The gutters have been pulling away from the roof line since August." Garrett said it like evidence. "I've mentioned it twice. And I'll get to it." "Dad," he spread his hands on the table, "we're trying to help you. This program releases equity while you keep living here. You would have additional income every month. Stacy and I could move into the guest wing and help with upkeep. You wouldn't be alone." I looked at the folder again, then at my son, then at the woman he'd married 6 years ago, who had never once in those 6 years asked how I was doing unless she wanted something. "The guest wing," I repeated. "It makes sense financially, for everyone. My nephew's already on the signature line." The consultant filled in the standard fields. "You'd just be confirming." I closed the folder. "I'm not signing this." The room changed. It wasn't dramatic, no raised voices yet, no movement, just a shift in atmosphere, the way a sky changes before weather arrives. Garrett sat back in his chair. "You haven't even read the full document." "I've read enough. A reverse mortgage means the lender takes the house when I die or move out. That's Carolyn's house. That's where your sister was born." "I'm not signing it." "Your sister." Stacy said it quietly, almost to herself, and the contempt in those 2 words was extraordinary. "Stacy." Garrett's voice carried a warning note. "No." She stood up. "I'm sorry, but we've spent 4 months working on this, Neal. 4 months. We hired a consultant. We had attorneys review the documents. We've been trying to do something genuinely helpful, and you're going to dismiss it in 30 seconds because of sentiment. It's my house. It's an asset you're hoarding while your son and his wife live in a 2-bedroom apartment and struggle every single month." Her voice had risen. "Do you know what Garrett's therapy costs? Do you know what our car payment is? Do you know how long we've been trading water?" I hadn't known about the therapy, that was new. But it didn't change what was in the folder. If you need financial help, I said, come to me and ask. I've helped before, but I won't sign over the equity in this house. You've helped. She laughed once, a short, sharp sound. You loaned Garrett $12,000 2 years ago and never once asked when he'd paid back. You floated us for 3 months when he lost his job at Lakeland. You act like you've been so generous, but every time we actually need something real. Stacy. Garrett's chair scraped back. He needs to hear this. She turned back to me. We've been subsidizing your comfort, Neal. The grocery runs, the rides to your cardiology appointments, the times we came over here and spent entire weekends cleaning out Carolyn's things so you didn't have to do it alone. We have done so much for this family, and you won't do one thing for us. I stood up. My back protested the way it always does in the morning. That slow complaint of joints that have been at it for nearly 7 decades. I appreciate what you've both done. I mean that. And if you need help, we can talk about help. But not this. I reached for the folder to hand it back. That was when Garrett moved. He wasn't violent. Not exactly. Not in the way that word usually means. He stepped between me and the table and put both hands flat on my chest and pushed. And I went backward into the kitchen wall hard enough that the framed photo of Carolyn and me at Door County shifted on its nail. I'm not a small man, but I'm 68 and I have a replaced hip on my left side, and I went into that wall and felt it in my spine and stood there for a moment trying to understand what had just happened. Garrett looked at his hands like they'd acted without him. Stacy said, Dad, that wasn't. Get out of my house. Neal, he didn't mean. Both of you, now. Garrett started to say something and stopped. He picked up the folder from the table and walked to the door. Stacy followed him. At the threshold, she turned back and said, You should think carefully about what you're throwing away. And then they were gone. I stood in my kitchen and breathed. The photo of Carolyn and me was still slightly crooked on the wall. I straightened it and then stood there looking at her face for a long moment. She was laughing in the picture, the way she always laughed, with her whole face. We'd been at the harbor in Ephraim. I dropped a fish. I picked up my phone and called the only person I knew would be awake at 7:40 in the morning and not ask foolish questions. My neighbor Vin Kowalczyk answered on the second ring. He was a retired Milwaukee firefighter, 71 years old, and had been my next-door neighbor since 2003. We had an understanding. When something important happened, we told each other. Something happened, I said. 20 minutes later, he was sitting across from me with a cup of coffee I'd poured him, and I was telling him everything. He let me talk without interrupting. Former fire department? You learn to gather information before you act. When I finished, he set down his mug. He put his hands on you. He pushed me. I hit the wall. That's Battery Neal. He's my son. He's a man who put his hands on a 68-year-old man in that man's own kitchen. Vin's voice was even, the way voices get when they're working to stay that way. That's what it is. You take the relationship out of it. That's what it is. I looked at my coffee. The reverse mortgage was already filled out with my name. How long do you think they've been planning this? I thought about the last 3 years. Garrett's casual intrusions, borrowing the truck without asking, having Stacy's sister's family use my driveway for an entire weekend. Once rearranging my basement shelving and telling me it was more efficient. I thought about the $12,000 I'd loaned him in 2022 that had never been mentioned again. I thought about Stacy's comment about 4 months of planning. Long enough, I said. You need to call the police. Vin, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking about Garrett at 10 years old. You're thinking about his mother's funeral. You're thinking that if you pick up that phone, you can't take it back. He leaned forward. But Neal, those documents had your name pre-filled. That's not a family disagreement. That's fraud preparation. And he put his hands on you in your own home. I walked to the window. Outside, the maple tree in the backyard was bare now, its branches holding nothing. Patient, the way trees are. Patient. The push itself hadn't left a mark, but my lower back was aching in the way that it does when something's been jolted, and I knew by evening it would be worse. I thought about what Carolyn would have said. She'd been clearer about people than I'd ever been, including about our son. Garrett is wonderful when things are easy, she told me once. Maybe 10 years ago. And I don't know yet who he is when they're hard. She'd found out in the end when she was sick. He'd called regularly but visited twice in 14 months. You're right, I said to Vin. I called 911 and reported a domestic battery at my address. The dispatcher was calm and thorough. Two officers arrived in 14 minutes. I met them at the door. Officer Dawson, a tall woman with close-cropped hair, and Officer Petrov, younger, who wrote everything down. I showed Officer Dawson the folder. I showed her the pre-filled signature line with my name. I described the push, the wall, the framed photograph. I lifted my shirt and she photographed the red mark on my lower back where I'd made contact with the wall's corner trim. Is your son still in the area? Dawson asked. I don't know. Petro was on his radio. Dawson asked me to walk through the timeline again, and I did, starting with the door opening without a knock. She asked about the folder, and I explained what a reverse mortgage was and what it would mean for my ownership of the property. She took photographs of every page. 40 minutes after I'd called, Dawson told me they had probable cause for battery and for the fraudulent document. They'd consulted with their sergeant about the pre-filled signature, and it met the threshold for further investigation. They found Garrett and Stacy at a Panera Bread 6 blocks away. Garrett was arrested on a battery charge. Stacy was detained for questioning regarding the mortgage documents. I sat in my living room with Vin and heard it all, secondhand, from the officer who came back to keep me updated. When the cruiser drove past my window, I watched it go. Vin handed me my coffee cup. It had gone cold and I drank it anyway. I want to tell you something about the weeks that followed, because this is where most people expect the story to end. It doesn't end with the arrest. It barely begins there. The first thing that happened was the financial picture. Garrett had hired the consultant, a man named no differently than 100 men in the greater Milwaukee area who operate in the gray zone between advice and fraud. When the district attorney's investigators started pulling records, they found that Garrett had already submitted a preliminary application to a reverse mortgage lender using a photocopied version of my signature from an old insurance document. He hadn't succeeded. The lender had flagged it for identity verification, but the attempt was documented. They also found, in the financial forensics, that the $12,000 I'd given Garrett in 2020 had gone not toward the apartment rent he'd described, but toward a delinquent balance on a home equity line of credit he'd taken out on an investment property I hadn't known he owned. A property that was now 2 years later in foreclosure. Stacy had known about all of it. The criminal charges expanded. Vin's friend, an attorney in Kessler who handled elder abuse cases in Milwaukee County, met with me on a Thursday morning and spread his own set of papers across my kitchen table. Identity fraud, attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Simple battle. Vulnerable adult, I said. It's a legal category, Kessler told me. He was a compact, precise man who seemed to choose each word with care. Wisconsin Statute 46-90's financial exploitation of an elderly person is its own offense, separate from ordinary fraud, and it carries harsher penalties. I don't feel vulnerable. The statute isn't about how you feel. It's about your age, your circumstances, and what they attempted. You were targeted specifically because of your age and your asset. That's exploitation by definition. He paused. You should know that the lender they contacted has a legal obligation to report the attempted fraud to the state. That report is now on file. This isn't going away quietly. It did not go away quietly. By the third week, Garrett's investment property had completed its foreclosure. The bank had been waiting on the process for months. His arrest accelerated the timeline on related credit reviews. 2 credit card accounts were closed. His employer, a project management firm in Brookfield, placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal case. Wisconsin employers in certain sectors are required to disclose pending felony charges, and Garrett's manager had found out through the county court's public records before Garrett had said a word. Stacy had been working in pharmaceutical sales and her company had a conduct clause in her employment contract. The investigation into her involvement in the document preparation. She had formatted and printed the mortgage folder, which her own printer's metadata confirmed, resulted in a termination letter the following Monday. I learned about most of this from Kessler, who tracked it the way I used to track tune-up schedules at the shop. What I tracked myself was harder to quantify. My daughter Lee called from Portland the same day Garrett was arrested. She was 59, practical, the kind of person who gathers information before she reacts. She'd flown back to Milwaukee when Carolyn died and had handled most of the practical arrangements while Garrett had made phone calls. Tell me everything, she said. I did. There was a long pause. Then, how's your back? Sore. Getting better. I'm booking a flight. Lay. You don't have to. Dad. Her voice was quiet and final. I'll be there Thursday. She stayed for 10 days. She met with Kostler twice. She went through my financial records with the focus of someone who had spent 20 years as a hospital administrator and knew what looked right and what didn't. She found, buried in a credit monitoring account I'd set up years ago and mostly forgotten, 3 soft inquiries on my credit file in the previous 8 months. From lenders, not from me. Garrett had been shopping the mortgage around for longer than 4 months. He's been doing this since last winter, Lee said, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where all of it had started. Her coffee was hot. Mine was getting cold again, which seems to be a theme in my life. The first inquiry is dated February. That's 9 months ago. I thought about Garrett at my table in February, telling me about a financial planning seminar he'd attended, asking questions about the house's assessed value, complimenting the neighborhood, the lot, the investment profile of the property. I had thought he was making conversation. He's been planning this since before the snow melted, I said. Lee didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the alley. I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Go ahead. Is there any part of you that still wants to protect him? I looked at the maple tree through the window. The first frost had come 2 nights ago, and the lawn had that particular grey-white color it gets in the early morning. Everything stiff and still. Yes, I said. A part of me. That part isn't wrong. He's your son. Lee wrapped both hands around her mug. But Neal, he planned this for 9 months. He had your signature photocopied of an old document. He came into your home and he pushed you into a wall. I know. The part that wants to protect him is the same part he was counting on. I didn't have an answer for that, so I just let it settle in the room the way the cold settles in through old window seals. Slowly, completely, until you stop pretending it isn't there. The court proceedings moved faster than Kostler had expected. Garrett's attorney attempted to characterize the push as accidental, a moment of frustrated movement rather than intentional battery. The judge reviewed the injury photographs and the pattern of conduct and was unpersuaded. 18 months of probation, mandatory counseling, and a no-contact order with me and my property. Restitution of the $12,000 with a payment schedule attached. Stacy's involvement in the document preparation resulted in a deferred prosecution agreement. She agreed to 200 hours of community service, a fraud awareness program, and 3 years of supervised probation. She and Garrett separated within 6 weeks of the sentencing hearing. Their apartment lease, which had been in her name, was terminated. She moved in with her mother in Racine. Garrett moved into a studio apartment in West Alice. I know because Kostler sends me the address updates in case the no-contact order needs to be enforced. On a Saturday in early February, about 10 weeks after the morning with the folder, I was back at my kitchen table. The maple tree outside was holding snow on its branches, each one outlined in white the way trees are in children's drawings. I'd made a proper breakfast for once. Eggs, toast, the kind of orange juice that comes in a carton and not a bottle. My phone rang and the caller ID said Margaret Tilson. My editor at a regional travel and food publication, a woman I've been writing for since I retired from the automotive shop in 2016. I write under a pen name. I always have. Carolyn knew, Lee knows. Garrett never did. He thought his father was a retired mechanic who'd gotten a modest insurance settlement when the shop soared. He thought I was managing on Social Security and a small pension, and that the house was the largest asset I had. It was wrong. The piece I'd sold to Midwest Dining Quarterly in October, a long constellation of the Lithuanian restaurants along South 13th Street in Milwaukee, what they preserve and what they've had to let go, had been nominated for a State Press Association award. Margaret was calling to tell me the nomination had been confirmed. Congratulations, she said. It's just a nomination. Don't do that. It's wonderful and you've earned it. A pause. Also, the journal wants to discuss a retainer. Regular column, monthly. I told them you need to see the offer before you committed. After we hung up, I sat for a while with my orange juice. The Garrett who'd pushed me into that wall had been calculating what I was worth in equity and fixed income. He'd been looking at the house and the pension and the Social Security and seeing the ceiling. He hadn't seen the lighting. He hadn't seen the $400 checks that had been landing in a separate account since 2016, building up the way water builds up behind a dam, quietly, invisibly, until you open the gate. He hadn't known who I was. I pulled my laptop toward me and opened the file I'd been working on for 2 weeks. A piece about a monk grocery in the River West neighborhood that had been operating in the same building since 1991. The owner, a woman in her 70s named Mai, had been making lemongrass paste by hand since she arrived in this city. I'd been there 3 times in 2 weeks, and she'd started setting out tea when she saw my car pull up. That morning I rode until 9:30 until the snow on the maple branches had mostly fallen and the trees stood clear and dark against a winter sky. Then I sent the draft to Margaret and made a second pot of coffee. The house settled around me the way it always does in winter, the furnace cycling on and off, the floors making their small adjustments in the cold. 37 years of sounds I know by heart. Restitution payments started arriving in March. $150 a month, which is almost nothing against $12,000. It'll take years. But the checks come on the 5th of each month, with the reliability that nothing else about Garrett ever had. Koisler says that's standard, that people often pay more consistently under court order than they ever did voluntarily. Lee calls on Sundays now, which she didn't used to. We talk for an hour sometimes about Portland and Milwaukee and the difference between the two kinds of winter. She's been sending me books, the kind with margin notes and folded pages, books she wants to talk about. We've started talking about those too. Vin comes over on Thursday nights for the Bucks game if they're playing early enough. He brings a six-pack and argues with the television and sometimes falls asleep in the chair before the fourth quarter. I don't wake him up until it's time to go. Last week I got a letter. No return address, postmarked West Alice. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Garrett's handwriting. I recognized it the way you recognize the handwriting of people you raised. The particular slant of the letters, the way he makes his capital G. It said, I know you won't answer this. I just need you to know that I understand what I did. I read it twice. Then I put it in the folder where I keep the court documents, the credit inquiry reports, the photograph of my lower back taken in my kitchen by Officer Dawson. I don't know yet what I'll do with any of it. What I know is this. I wake up at 5:30. I make coffee. I read the paper and then I open my laptop and I write about places where people feed each other. Restaurants and groceries and the particular care that goes into preparing a meal for a stranger. It turns out that after 68 years of living, that's what I have to say. And it turns out that a man I thought I'd raised knew nothing about it. The maple tree will come back in April, the way it always does. It doesn't need anyone's permission. The morning Garrett walked into my kitchen with that leather portfolio, I was a man who still made excuses for his son. That's the honest truth of it. Every time he'd taken something. The truck without asking, the $12,000 that went nowhere, the quiet presumption that my home was already partly his. I'd found a way to frame it as family, as a rough patch, as something a father should absorb. I told myself that was love. I think now it was something closer to fear. Fear of the empty chair across the table. Fear of becoming the old man who drove his only son away. What I've had to reckon with in the months since the sheriff's car disappeared around the corner is that the love I thought I was showing Garrett was actually teaching him something terrible. Every time I swallowed my objection and called it patience, I was telling him that his behavior had no consequences. I was building, slowly and with the best intentions, a man who believed he could take whatever he decided he deserved. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with, but I think it's true, and I think the honest ones have to say it. There's a clarity that comes after betrayal that you can't manufacture any other way. Vin had it the moment I knocked on his door. He saw the situation plainly because he hadn't spent 30 years softening it. Lee had it on the phone from Portland before she'd even booked a flight. The people who loved me without needing something from me could see exactly what had happened. I was the last one to get there. That gap between what I knew and what I was willing to act on. That's the thing I keep thinking about. Knowing something isn't the same as being willing to stand inside it and hold your ground. I had the knowledge for years. What I was slow to develop was the nerve. I don't use the word courage lightly. It's a word that gets attached to big moments, to fires and battlefields. But I think most of the courage a person actually uses in a lifetime gets spent on small, private decisions. The decision to pick up the phone and call 991 on your own son. The decision to hand a folder back across the table and say no. The decision to stop explaining away behavior that has no good explanation. That kind of courage doesn't feel heroic when you're doing it. It just feels like something that has to happen before anything else can. What I know now that I didn't know the morning I straightened that picture of Carolyn on the wall is this. The life a person has built over 68 years isn't just property. It isn't just equity or assessed value or a line on a balance sheet. It's the record of what they chose day after day, when no one was keeping score. Garrett tried to convert my life into a number he could borrow against. He didn't understand, and maybe I'd never made it clear enough that the whole point of building something carefully is to decide for yourself what it's worth. The maple tree came back in April, right on schedule. It doesn't need anyone's permission, and neither do I.